Okay, moving on to The Merchant of Venice, Act 1, Scene 2. First off, what happens in this scene? In Act 1, Scene 1, we were introduced to Antonio and Bassanio, and Act 1, Scene 2 switches to Portia and Nerissa. Portia explains the situation of her suitors, who are coming to try and get her hand in marriage, and she mocks them. The will is explained. We learn that Portia's father recently died, but he stated in his will that his daughter must marry the man who chooses the correct of one of three caskets. So her father has some control over who she's going to marry. And then at the end of the scene, we hear that the Prince of Morocco, one of those suitors, has arrived. So let's have a look at some analysis. Now, the structure of this whole play is really interesting. Act 1, Scene 1 established the characters of Antonio and Bassanio and their storyline, essentially, that Antonio is a wealthy merchant whose money is all at sea. Bassanio, his friend, wants to borrow money so that he can woo Portia, and Antonio says, look, go on, I've got no money on me, but if you can borrow some, under my name, that's fine. And Bassanio goes off to do that, and we might anticipate that Act 1 Scene 2 would be the continuation of that storyline, but it completely switches to another set of characters, that of Portia and Nerissa. And this alternating structure is found throughout the text, often at moments of great tension. When we're really tense, expecting something big to happen, the storyline just changes to something totally different. And that's one of Shakespeare's structural devices. So when we're analysing a text, we want to look at language, structure and form. And structure is often the trickiest one to look at, but this is one of Shakespeare's uses of structure here, that he alternates what's going on in different scenes. And that heightens the tension in the play. It keeps the audience really excited to know what's going to happen. So, we learn something big like the fact that Bassanio is going off to try and borrow money, and then the focus changes. And that is one of the things that Shakespeare does to keep this play entertaining. Because it's a comedy, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but because it's not full of massive dramatic events like perhaps some of the tragedy plays are, the structure is used to make sure things keep sort of ticking along nicely. Now, the opening to Act 1, Scene 2 is where we see Portia. Now, from her description in Act 1, Scene 1, we're probably going to think Portia's going to be this weak, insipid character. We know that she is the object of many men's desire and very passive, almost victim-like. But that's a completely incorrect assumption. Act 1, Scene 2 then opens with Portia's line, "By my troth, Nerissa, my little body is aweary of this great world." In other words, I'm really, really sad. And it's interesting because that echoes the opening of Act 1, Scene 1 with Antonio's words, "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad." So we have two scenes that begin with two characters basically saying the same thing. And there's lots of ways you can look at, well, why is that? There are lots of ideas. But one idea is that perhaps they have a similar role in who they are to Bassanio, who Antonio is and who Portia will ultimately be. But of course, the thing is, we know that Antonio is sad, and we can only speculate as to why he's sad. Is it because he's going to lose his friend Bassanio? Is it because he has all his wealth at sea? But we never really get to the bottom of that. But of course, we can understand why Portia is sad, and it's very much understandable, because her father, even though he's dead, has arranged the terms of her marriage, and Portia expresses her frustration to her maid Nerissa, saying, "I may neither choose who I would nor refuse who I dislike. So is the will of a living daughter curbed by the will of a dead father." Now, today, as a modern audience, we would look at that and think it's crazy and ridiculous. But we need to understand a little bit about context. An Elizabethan audience wouldn't have the same reaction that we have. In today's society, arranged marriage is not the norm in Western society. There are some religions, of course, that still have arranged marriages, but even those who have arranged marriages might find this arranged marriage to be, pretty challenging, because obviously her father is dead and isn't directly picking who she's going to marry. He's just organised this sort of practically game show-esque competition where if you want to marry her, you've got 3 boxes and you choose a box, and if you choose the right one that's got her picture in it, you get to marry her. So there seems to be no sense of justice. So arranged marriage was the norm in Shakespeare's time, but this takes it to a whole new level. There doesn't seem to be any kind of logic behind it. Of course, we learn later in the play that there is a rationale behind the decision, but it doesn't seem to be fair in any way, and it doesn't seem, of course, to have any bearing on what Portia might want, which is the bit that we might struggle with today. But marriage was very different in Shakespeare's time. To begin with, ages were very different. In Shakespeare's day, it was actually legal to get married for a girl at the age of 12. But that wasn't normal. Most women got married today, just like today, in their 20s. Did a little bit of research. In the UK, the average age of marriage for a woman in 2013 is 28. In 1590 it was 27. So, late 20s, most women got married. But a special exception was often made for rich and noble families who would marry off their young children for reasons of property and family alliance. And that's what we see in a lot of Shakespeare's plays, in Romeo and Juliet, for example. Juliet's a young girl, but she's going to be married off to Paris because of the sort of wealthy families and the elite. Ironically, it was better in some ways to be poor, because if you were poor in Shakespeare's time, there were no arranged marriages because nobody had anything to offer. It wouldn't be like Sally marries Bob because Sally's got a chicken and Bob's got a spade. It would be that kind of thing. So there's just no point. So arranged marriage in noble families was something that was accepted in Elizabethan England, which means perhaps the audience at the time watching this play would not find this so shocking. It's interesting because when you're analysing Shakespeare, we want to look for alternative interpretations, and one of the simple ways of doing that, to look at things in a different way, is just to write about how a modern audience would react and how that would be different to an Elizabethan audience. And that is no more obvious than in scenes of marriage, because often, we have a totally different attitude today. But of course, in this play, The Merchant of Venice, there's a lot of racism, which today's society we find completely disgusting as well, and religious persecution, and lots of things that are shocking to us as modern audiences. So given the fact that Portia's so unhappy about her father's order, we might wonder, why doesn't she just ignore it? He's dead after all. But again, it's important to understand that historical context. In Shakespeare's time, women were seen as nothing more than mothers and objects of male desire. So most women were denied anything beyond a basic schooling, and even when girls did go to grammar schools, many classes had male-only signs on the doors, and girls would only be taught the most basic subjects. Upper-class families, and Portia would certainly fit into that, would hire tutors to teach their children, but even then the prospects for an educated woman were very slim. Women couldn't enter any profession, they couldn't vote, they were really just being prepared for motherhood and that domestic sphere. They would be taught how to cook, how to sew, how to play instruments, just to do things that would serve their husbands and entertain their husbands. And that was really the only option for a woman, to get married and to run the household. So with that in mind, we might see Portia and all women of the time actually fated to be ending up attached to a man. So in some ways you could argue that the dad wasn't all bad, because he knew that, she needed a husband. Perhaps he knew that she was headstrong, and, he wanted to just make sure she got a husband because that's what she needed. Now, of course, that's different in today's society. Women don't need to marry. Women can be educated and have jobs and be successful. Although, there still are issues of inequality between men and women. Studies show that 90% of the top bosses in big companies are men. Where women are the big bosses in companies, it's because they've brought that company up themselves from scratch, like Anita Roddick with the Body Shop. She's the head of that, but she started it. So there is still a massive inequality. Society might like to portray the idea, and certainly we should be fighting for the idea of equality, but in reality, it's not quite there yet. But obviously, very different to Shakespeare's time. Now, another thing is about women or females being dependent on men. You see, as children, girls would rely on their fathers for financial support and protection. And when they got married, that responsibility passed on to the husband. And it was almost unheard of not to marry in Shakespeare's time. Act 1, Scene 2 is filled with jokes and wordplay and humour from Portia. And it's quite interesting because Shakespeare often gives women in his plays the strongest lines and the kind of wittiest jokes, and he can be seen as an early feminist writer in the sense that he empowers women and often makes them much more kind of impressive and intellectual and clever, witty than the male characters. And of course we see that at the end of the play when Portia ultimately goes head to head to do verbal battle against Shylock. So where are some of the jokes? Some of them are pretty tricky to understand, but when she's talking about the Neapolitan prince who talked of nothing but his horse, she jokes with Nerissa that I am much afeard my lady his mother played false with a smith. So the joke there is that, he's so obsessed with horses, I'm actually think he might be the illegitimate son of a blacksmith, an iron worker whose job involved working with horses. Now that might not sound like much of a joke, but it's quite a risky comment to make, and it's certainly not presenting Portia as the passive, quiet woman. She also says, I'd rather be married to Death's Head with a bone in his mouth than to either of these. And as I was reading that, it really reminded me of the words of Beatrice in the opening scene of Much Ado About Nothing, also by Shakespeare. I'd rather hear my dog bark at a crow than a man swear he loves me. So Shakespeare, as I said, has this little thing about strong women. And again, Portia being this sort of woman who is skilled in verbal combat foreshadows the later scenes where she's going to go to battle with Shylock. Shakespeare certainly has a sort of passion for presenting strong women. But we need to remember that this play is a comedy. So although Portia is intelligent and headstrong and witty, that actually makes us, I think, all the more sad that she's unable to choose her own husband, but must be, as the quote says, obtained by the manner of my father's will. And in a sense, this play is starting to feel a bit depressing. So we can see that in Act 1, Scene 1, Antonio's sad, Bassanio wants this woman and he's sad that he can't have her. In Act 1, Scene 2, we see that Portia is sad and is kind of ruled by a ridiculous, dictate of her father. And it's a little bit depressing. So we need to remember that this is a comedy. And because of that, Shakespeare points the way to a happy ending. When Portia and Nerissa at the end of the scene talk of Bassanio, then Portia talks about him being worthy of praise. So despite the negativity that's in the opening two scenes, this moment hints to the audience that there will, as required in a comedy play, be a happy ending to look forward to. So what about comedy? Today we think of comedy as being, Ben Stiller or Adam Sandler, the sort of Step Brothers films, but comedy was a little bit different in Shakespeare's time. The genre of comedy doesn't actually mean the play is going to be filled with jokes. There is witty wordplay, as we've already seen. There are puns, but comedies often contain dark and sinister moments too. And this play clearly has some very dark, sinister, depressing moments in it. So the easiest way to identify a comedy is to compare it to other genres. A tragedy ends in death. So Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. Romeo and Juliet die at the end. Hamlet is a tragedy. Hamlet dies at the end. In fact, pretty much everybody dies in the end. So if a play is a tragedy, no matter what happens, we know there's going to be death at the end. And that really ties into Aristotle, the Greek philosopher's theories on tragedy, that it's somebody of noble birth, a good person with a fatal flaw that brings about their ultimate demise, their death. And in Romeo and Juliet, we see that, Romeo is a good person, he's respected, he's upper class, but ultimately can't control his ways with women, and he ends up dying. And it's possible to see The Merchant of Venice opening, in a way that it could well be a tragedy. You could read the first two scenes and think, okay, Bassanio is the tragic hero, because, or even, dramatically, Portia is the tragic hero, because this is going to work out bad for her. We don't see any way this is going to end positively. And that's why there's the talk of Bassanio. Now, I don't personally think at this point Bassanio is presented as somebody that we should even really like. He seems like an idiot. And the idea that the best possible outcome for Portia is that she marries Bassanio seems quite depressing altogether. But, of course, she likes him, so it's going to be okay. So one thing is, a comedy doesn't end in death. It actually often ends in marriage. And there are complex plots and cases of mistaken identity. Now, there are 18 plays by Shakespeare that are identified as comedies and contain most of those conventions. But of course, in The Merchant of Venice, we see all of that. We see marriage, we see complex plots. We're already seeing the complex plot in the fact that two scenes introduce different sets of characters with different storylines and subplots and all the rest of it, and it gets more and more complex. And of course, mistaken identity and disguise form a massive part of this play later on. So because of that, a knowledgeable audience would know that this play is going to end positively, with Portia and Bassanio getting married. Despite the negativity of the opening two scenes, an audience wouldn't really be concerned. They're going to think, no, I know this is going to play out okay, and we'll just hold on to see how that eventually happens. So that's Act 1, Scene 2. And in the next video, we'll move on to Act 1, Scene 3.